The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the man in the uniform, Officer Mark Harris, a seasoned cop with over a decade on the force. He stood tall, his posture radiating confidence, his voice steady as he recounted the events of that night. His testimony was crisp, deliberate, and laced with the kind of authority that made it hard to doubt him. He was sure of himself, certain that the jury would see things his way. After all, he'd been here before. He knew how this worked. But this time something was different. This time the woman sitting across from him wasn't just another defendant. She wasn't just another face in the system. She was calm, composed, and there was something in her eyes, a quiet intensity that made him pause just for a moment. Her name was Alicia Johnson, and she wasn't what anyone expected. The case had started like so many others. A routine traffic stop gone wrong. Officer Harris had pulled her over for a broken taillight, or so he claimed. But Alicia's version of the story was starkly different. She said he'd targeted her, that he'd been aggressive from the start, and that things had escalated quickly. She'd recorded part of the encounter on her phone, and the footage had gone viral, sparking outrage and protests. Now here they were, in a packed courtroom, with the world watching. The stakes were high and the tension was palpable. Officer Harris was determined to prove he'd done nothing wrong. Alicia was just as determined to prove otherwise. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about power, about who had it and who didn't. And then, just when it seemed like the case might swing in his favor, Alicia dropped a bombshell. It happened. During cross-examination, the defense attorney, a sharp woman named Lisa Morales, was pressing Alicia about her background, trying to paint her as someone with an axe to grind. "Ms. Johnson," she began, her tone clipped, "you've been very vocal about your distrust of law enforcement. Isn't it true that you have a history of confrontations with the police?" Alicia didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone, her voice calm but firm. "I don't have a history of confrontations," she said. "I have a history of standing up for what's right." The attorney smirked, sensing an opening. "And what makes you qualified to decide what's right?" she shot back. That's when Alicia paused, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing squarely on Officer Harris. "Because," she said, her voice steady, "I'm the Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice." The room erupted. Gasps echoed off the walls, and even the judge looked stunned. Officer Harris froze, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. The Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division? Here? In this courtroom? His mind raced as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a case about a traffic stop anymore. This was about accountability, about systemic issues that went far beyond this room. Alicia's revelation had changed everything. The tension in the air was electric, and the jury's faces were a mix of shock and curiosity. What did this mean for the case? What did it mean for Officer Harris? And what did it mean for the broader conversation about justice and power in America? As the judge called for a recess, the camera panned to Alicia, still seated, her expression unreadable. Officer Harris stood, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his notes. The once confident cop now looked uncertain, his earlier bravado replaced by a flicker of doubt. The screen faded to black, leaving viewers hanging on the edge of their seats. What would happen next? How would this revelation shape the outcome of the trial? And what did it mean for the larger fight for justice? The story was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be even more explosive. But for now, all anyone could do was wait, their minds buzzing with questions, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. The recess felt like it lasted an eternity. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, the kind of low murmurs that seemed to hum with anticipation. Reporters scrambled to update their headlines, their fingers flying across keyboards as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. Alicia Johnson, the unassuming woman at the center of this case, wasn't just a defendant. She was a high-ranking official in one of the most powerful organizations in the country, the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, the very agency tasked with holding law enforcement accountable. It was a twist no one saw coming, least of all Officer Mark Harris. As the cameras outside the courthouse captured the chaos, Alicia remained calm. She sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. She'd known this moment would come, of course. She'd prepared for it. But nothing could have prepared her for the way it felt to see the shock on Officer Harris's face, the way his confidence had faltered. She didn't take pleasure in it. This wasn't about winning or losing for her. It was about something much bigger. It was about justice, about fairness, about making sure that no one else had to go through what she'd been through. The story of how Alicia ended up in that courtroom began years earlier, long before the traffic stop that had brought her here. She'd grown up in a small town in the Midwest, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. From a young age, Alicia had seen how the system could fail people, especially those who didn't have the means to fight back. She'd watched her mother struggle to navigate a world that seemed stacked against her, and it had left a lasting impression. Alicia had always been determined to make a difference, to be a voice for those who didn't have one. She'd worked her way through college, then law school, driven by a fierce sense of purpose. When she joined the Department of Justice, it felt like she was finally in a position to create real change. But she quickly learned that change wasn't easy, especially when it came to challenging powerful institutions. Officer Harris, on the other hand, had come from a very different background. He'd grown up in a family of cops, his father and grandfather both serving on the force. For him, law enforcement wasn't just a job, it was a legacy. He'd joined the police academy straight out of high school, eager to follow in their footsteps. Over the years, he'd built a reputation as a no-nonsense officer, someone who got the job done. He believed in the system, in the badge he wore, in the idea that he was one of the good guys. But lately, things had started to feel different. The protests, the scrutiny, the constant questions about his actions, it was all starting to wear on him. He told himself he was just doing his job, that he was on the right side of the law. But deep down, there was a part of him that wondered if he was on the right side of history. The traffic stop that had led to this trial had been a turning point for both of them. For Alicia, it was a stark reminder of why she'd chosen this path in the first place. She'd been driving home from work that night, exhausted after a long day, when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. At first, she hadn't thought much of it. She'd pulled over, assuming it was just a routine check. But then Officer Harris had approached her car, his tone sharp, his questions accusatory. She'd tried to stay calm, to explain that her taillight was out and that she'd get it fixed as soon as possible. But things had escalated quickly. Before she knew it, he was ordering her out of the car, his hand resting on his holster. She'd felt a surge of fear, but also anger. Why was this happening? What had she done to deserve this? She'd reached for her phone, instinctively hitting record, not knowing that the footage would soon be seen by millions. For Officer Harris, the stop had been routine, or so he told himself. He'd noticed the broken taillight, sure, but there was something else too. Something about the way she'd looked at him, the way she'd spoken, had set him on edge. He'd told himself he was just being cautious, that he had to be careful. Situations like this. But as the encounter spiraled out of control, he'd found himself questioning his own actions. Why had he been so quick to escalate? Why had he let his emotions get the better of him? He'd replayed the scene in his mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how many times he went over it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line. Now, as the trial resumed, the tension in the room was thicker than ever. The judge called for order, and the jury filed back in, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Alicia's attorney, Lisa Morales, stood to address the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "we'd like to call Ms. Johnson back to the stand." The judge nodded, and Alicia rose, her movements calm and deliberate. As she took her seat, the room seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. What would she say? How would she explain her role in all of this? And what did it mean for the case? Alicia took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Officer Harris. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. She knew what was at stake, not just for her, but for him. For the system, for everyone watching. This wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about accountability, about fairness, about the kind of world they wanted to live in. And as she began to speak, her voice clear and unwavering, it was clear that this was just the beginning. The real battle was just getting started. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the determination in her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice. The screen faded to black once more, leaving viewers hanging on the edge of their seats. What would happen next? How would the jury react? And what did Alicia's revelation mean for the future of the case? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be even more intense. As Alicia settled back into the witness stand, the weight of the room's attention pressed down on her. She could feel the eyes of the jury, the judge, the spectators, and even Officer Harris, who sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his jaw clenched. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath held as Lisa Morales approached her with a calm but deliberate stride. "Ms. Johnson," Lisa began, her tone measured, "can you please explain to the court how your role at the Department of Justice relates to this case?" Alicia nodded, her gaze steady. "Of course," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "As the Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division, my job is to ensure that the rights of every individual are protected, especially when it comes to interactions with law enforcement. This case isn't just about me. It's about the systemic issues that allow situations like this to happen repeatedly. It's about holding people accountable, no matter who they are or what uniform they wear." The room seemed to shift at her words. Some jurors leaned forward, their interest piqued, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Officer Harris shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He'd spent years believing in the system, in the idea that he was one of the good guys. But now, sitting across from someone who represented the very institution tasked with overseeing that system, he couldn't help but feel a gnawing doubt creeping in. Was he part of the problem? Or was he just doing his job? The questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the case at hand. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the story was spreading like wildfire. News outlets had picked up on Alicia's revelation, and social media was ablaze with reactions. Hashtags like Justice for Alicia and SARS Accountability now began trending, with people from all walks of life weighing in. Some praised Alicia for her courage, calling her a hero for standing up to systemic injustice. Others criticized her, accusing her of using her position to manipulate the case. The debate was polarizing, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. But amidst the noise, there were quieter voices, people who had their own stories to tell. Stories of traffic stops gone wrong, of encounters with law enforcement that had left them feeling powerless, of moments where they'd wished someone like Alicia had been there to stand up for them. One of those voices belonged to Marcus Green, a 28-year-old construction worker who had been following the trial closely. Marcus had his own history with the police, one that had left him with a deep mistrust of the system. He'd been pulled over multiple times, often for reasons that felt flimsy at best. Each time he'd been left feeling humiliated, angry, and powerless. When he saw Alicia's story, it struck a chord. He felt seen in a way he hadn't before, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this case was about more than just one woman. It was about all of them, the people who'd been pushed to the margins, who'd been made to feel like they didn't matter. Marcus decided to reach out to Alicia's legal team, offering to share his story if it could help. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but he had to try. Back in the courtroom, Lisa Morales continued her questioning, carefully guiding Alicia through her testimony. "Ms. Johnson," she said, Can you tell us about the night of the traffic stop? What happened from your perspective? Alicia took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to that moment. I was driving home from work, she began. It had been a long day and I was tired. When I saw the lights behind me, I pulled over immediately. I thought it was just a routine stop. But when Officer Harris approached my car, his tone was aggressive from the start. I tried to stay calm, to explain that I was aware of the broken taillight and that I planned to get it fixed. But he wasn't listening. He ordered me out of the car, and when I asked why, he became even more confrontational. I felt scared, but I also felt angry. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet I was being treated like a criminal. As Alicia spoke, the room seemed to hang on her every word. Even the judge, who had heard countless testimonies over the years, leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Officer Harris, meanwhile, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He remembered that night vividly, but his recollection was different. In his mind, he'd been doing his job, following protocol. He'd told himself that Alicia's defiance was a red flag, that he had to be cautious. But now, hearing her side of the story, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd misread the situation. Had he let his biases cloud his judgment? The thought unsettled him, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the case. He couldn't afford to doubt himself now. Lisa Morales paused, letting Alicia's words sink in before continuing. And what happened after you were ordered out of the car? She asked. Alicia's expression hardened slightly. I complied, she said. But as I stepped out, I noticed Officer Harris had his hand on his holster. It was a small movement, but it sent a clear message. I felt like my life was in danger. That's when I reached for my phone and started recording. I didn't know if it would make a difference, but I wanted to have proof of what was happening. The room was silent as Alicia's words hung in the air. The footage she'd captured had been played earlier in the trial, and it had been damning. It showed Officer Harris's aggressive tone, his quick escalation, and the fear in Alicia's voice. For many in the room, it was hard to watch. For Officer Harris, it was even harder to relive. As the testimony continued, the tension in the room grew. The case was no longer just about a traffic stop. It was about power, accountability, and the systems that governed their lives. It was about who had the right to feel safe and who had the power to decide. And as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. The screen faded to black once more, leaving viewers with more questions than answers. What would happen next? How would the jury react, and what did this case mean for the future of justice in America? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be even more intense. The courtroom was electric, the kind of tension that makes your skin prickle and your heart race. Every word spoken felt like a spark, threatening to ignite something much bigger. Alicia's testimony had laid bare the raw nerves of the case, and now it was Officer Harris's turn to take the stand. He walked up slowly, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But for the first time, he didn't look invincible. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named David Carter, stood to begin his questioning. Officer Harris, he started, his tone calm but probing. Can you tell the court your version of events from the night in question? Harris cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I was on patrol that night, he began, his voice steady but quieter than usual. I noticed a vehicle with a broken taillight and initiated a routine traffic stop. When I approached the car, the driver, Ms. Johnson, seemed agitated. I asked her to step out of the vehicle for my safety and hers. She was uncooperative, and I felt the need to assert control over the situation. His words were measured, rehearsed, but there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. He was trying to stick to the script, to the story he'd told himself 100 times. But something about Alicia's presence, about the weight of her role and the intensity of her testimony, was making it harder to hold on to. David Carter nodded, his expression unreadable. "And when Ms. Johnson began recording the encounter, how did that make you feel?" he asked. Harris hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I felt challenged," he admitted, "like she was trying to provoke me. In my experience, when someone starts recording, it's because they're looking for a fight." The words hung in the air, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Alicia's attorney, Lisa Morales, exchanged a glance with her client, her expression sharp. She knew this was a critical moment, a chance to peel back the layers of Harris's testimony and expose the cracks beneath. When it was her turn to cross-examine, Lisa stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She approached the witness stand, her eyes locked on Harris. "Officer Harris," she began, her tone calm but cutting. "You said you felt challenged when Ms. Johnson started recording. But isn't it true that citizens have the right to record police interactions?" Harris shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. "Yes," he said carefully, "but it's not always safe. It can escalate situations." Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And yet," she continued, "Ms. Johnson was simply exercising her rights, wasn't she? She wasn't armed. She wasn't threatening you. She was just documenting what was happening. So why did you feel the need to escalate the situation?" Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, he looked almost lost, like a man who'd been caught in a lie he didn't even realize he was telling. The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Lisa pressed on, her voice steady but relentless. "Officer Harris, do you believe that your actions that night were justified?" she asked. He hesitated again, his eyes darting to the jury, then to the judge, then back to Lisa. I was doing my job," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was following protocol." Lisa paused, letting his words sink in before delivering her next question. "And what if your protocol is part of the problem?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. "What if the way you were trained, the way you were taught to handle these situations is what led to this moment? What if this isn't just about you, but about a system that's failing everyone, including you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Harris looked down at his hands, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but he wasn't ready to say it out loud. Outside the courtroom, the world was watching. The trial had become a flashpoint, a symbol of the larger conversations about justice, accountability, and power. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs demanding change, their voices rising in unison. News cameras captured every moment, every reaction, every twist and turn. And in the middle of it all was Alicia, sitting quietly at the defense table, her expression unreadable. She knew what was at stake, not just for her, but for everyone who'd ever felt powerless in the face of authority. She knew this case was bigger than her, bigger than Harris, bigger than the courtroom itself. And she knew that whatever happened next would have ripple effects far beyond these walls. As the day's proceedings came to a close, the judge called for a recess, and the room erupted into a low hum of conversation. The jury filed out, their faces a mix of confusion and contemplation. Harris stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped, his confidence visibly shaken. Alicia remained seated, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze fixed on some distant point. The screen faded to black, leaving viewers on the edge of their seats. What would happen next? How would the jury decide? And what did this case mean for the future of justice in America? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain: the climax was coming. And when it did, it would change everything. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled, and even the standing room at the back was crowded with onlookers. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your palms sweat. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for. The jury had deliberated for what felt like an eternity, and now they were ready to deliver their verdict. Alicia sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked calm, but inside, Her heart was racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about justice, accountability, and the kind of world they all wanted to live in. Officer Harris sat a few feet away, his uniform still crisp but his face pale and drawn. The trial had taken its toll on him, and it showed. He'd spent the last few days replaying the events of that night in his mind, questioning every decision he'd made. He'd always believed he was one of the good guys, but now he wasn't so sure. The questions Lisa Morales had asked during cross-examination had stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. What if she was right? What if the system he'd dedicated his life to was part of the problem? He didn't have answers, and that scared him more than anything. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of excessive use of force, she began, her voice steady, we find the defendant, Officer Mark Harris, guilty. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and a few scattered cheers filled the air. Alicia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the verdict sink in. It wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for everyone who'd ever felt powerless in the face of authority. It was a win for accountability. Harris sat frozen, his face a mask of shock. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind, over and over. He'd never imagined it would come to this. He'd always believed in the system, in the badge he wore, in the idea that he was on the right side of the law. But now, sitting in that courtroom, he felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He looked over at Alicia, and for the first time he really saw her, not as a defendant, not as an adversary, but as a person who'd been through something traumatic, something he'd played a part in. And in that moment, he felt a pang of something he hadn't expected, regret. The judge called for order, and the room quieted down. He turned to Alicia, his expression solemn. Ms. Johnson, he said, this court acknowledges the courage it took for you to come forward and share your story. Your actions have sparked an important conversation, one that this country desperately needs to have. While this verdict cannot undo what happened, it is a step toward accountability and justice. Alicia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't feel like a hero. She just felt relieved. Relieved that someone had listened, that someone had cared enough to make things right. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was immediate. News cameras swarmed the steps of the courthouse, capturing every moment as Alicia and her legal team emerged. Protesters cheered, their signs held high, their voices rising in a chorus of hope and determination. Alicia paused at the top of the steps, taking in the scene. She hadn't expected this, any of it. She just wanted to do what was right. But now, standing there, she realized that her story had become something much bigger. It had become a symbol, a rallying cry for change. She stepped up to the microphones, her voice steady but filled with emotion. This verdict isn't just about me, she began. It's about everyone who's ever felt like their voice didn't matter. It's about holding people accountable, no matter who they are or what uniform they wear. But it's also about healing, about coming together to create a system that works for everyone, not just a few. This is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done, but today we took a step in the right direction. As she spoke, the crowd erupted into applause. People chanted her name, their voices filled with hope and determination. Alicia stepped back, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now, not ever. Meanwhile, Harris sat in the empty courtroom, his head in his hands. The verdict had been a wake-up call, a harsh reminder that the system he'd believed in wasn't perfect, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to reflect, to learn, to do better. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew one thing: he couldn't go back to the way things were. He had to change. He had to be better. The screen faded to black, leaving viewers with a sense of closure but also a call to action. The story of Alicia Johnson and Officer Harris wasn't all. just about one trial or one verdict. It was about the larger fight for justice, accountability, and systemic change. It was a reminder that every voice matters, that every action counts, and that together they could create a world where fairness and equality weren't just ideals. They were realities. As the credits rolled, the final message appeared on the screen. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Stay informed. Stay engaged. Be the change. And with that, the story came to a close, leaving viewers with a sense of hope and a renewed determination to fight for a better future.